Okay. Hey, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I'm here joined by Zevi Slavin. Although I don't know Zevi for a long period of time, we've had a really excellent conversation up on his list. And I've listened on Seekers of Unity. I've listened to him talk with John Vervaeke, Guy Senstock. He's a real brilliant fellow traveler in this space. Zevi, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's so much fun to be here. It was really great to have you over on my show, and it's great to be back here. The way that these conversations are evolving organically and taking their life and shape is just really exciting to be a part of. So thank you for extending the conversation, and I'm psyched to be here with you, Gregg.
Great, man. It's wonderful to have you here. You've been in my head a little bit because I've been listening to the dialogos that you and John and Guy have been having about Martin Buber and I-thou relations and other kinds of things. But my hope today is we just sort of start off with your narrative. You have such a fascinating life story that sort of winded you into mysticism and Seekers of Unity. I wonder if you could just introduce yourself a little bit and share some of that narrative with the crowd here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, with pleasure. I would love to share that. I think it's also really cool that we frame it as a narrative, right? That we're not sharing facts or history, even though those are end up being narratives too. But it's one particular telling of a story that can be told so many ways. And
Amen.
So we try not to make ourselves limited to our narratives, but also try to express ourselves each time and move through our narratives. And that's a very fun thing to be doing.
It's part of my nature trained as a clinician. I definitely frame the sort of the egoic narrative as the starting point of the way at least I connect and get to know people. So,
yeah, absolutely. And if there's any particular questions that you have on any particular aspect of the narrative that you're interested in me getting into more or changing the narrative, we can. My narrative is flexible and is open to.
It's always evolving, isn't it?
Absolutely, in every moment. All right. So I was born in Sydney, Australia. My dad's American, which is why my accent is not fully Australian. I was born into a Hasidic family. My parents were sent to Sydney actually by the 7th Chabad Rebbe on a religious mission to bring Jews closer back to Judaism. So I was raised in a very, very staunchly Orthodox Hasidic practicing Jewish home and family, which was a very beautiful experience to be grounded so deeply in such an ancient and beautiful tradition. There's a certain adolescent tendency to stop taking things that you were taught for as a child for granted and begin to want to explore them on your own. And that definitely happened to me going through my 15, 16, 17. And I began to explore other religions, other traditions. And instead of discovering in them the proverbial other, that was the enemy of what I'd been taught, I ended up finding a lot of similarity and a lot of really strong kinship between the deepest thoughts of other traditions and my own tradition, which was definitely a very weird thing. Sometimes we're trained, we're used to finding otherness and strangeness, and that's more comfortable because we know who we are, we know who they are. When you find deep commonality and similarity with what we thought was other, that was a really trippy experience. And it was all very cerebral, very intellectual, lots of reading, lots of studying, much in similar ways that you've narrativized your journey in that sense. And finding this common underlying theme.
Can I pause you there for just a sec? Because give us a little bit more, or give me a little bit more of the flavor of your community. Like, how large was it? Were you isolated? Was it, so I'm just trying to get a flavor of what a Hasidic community might look like in Australia.
Yeah. So a Hasidic community is an interesting beast, and they're not all the same. There are different sorts. Generally,
I thought always those them people were always the same.
Right, the other is homogenized, but yeah, no, it's really great to meet what we thought to be other and to find particularity, to find individuality, to find difference. There's a lot of beauty in that, and I'm also really privileged to be able to share my world, which is a larger other to people, and to open it up to people. So the Hasidic community, there are many forms of Hasidism alive today, many different dynasties and streams that emerged out of Eastern Europe, beginning roughly in the 18th century. And the particular movement that I belong to is less insular by design than the others. It's known as the Chabad movement or the Lubavitch movement, where there's a lot of emphasis, particularly in the last generation or two of the movement, from from the leadership, from the Rebbe, as the term is used, to turn the movement outwards, to go to missionize to other Jews, to bring them back closer to their heritage. So out of all the Hasidic movements, the Chabad movement is the most engaged with modern technology and reaching out to people through all kinds of means. The first ever was the first to use the radio and TV and internet to reach out to people. So while it's still very strong and very strict about its own adherence and practices, there is a sense of integration with the outside world. Gotcha. And I wasn't, the Hasidic community that I lived in wasn't an isolated world unto itself, like the communities in Borough Park or Williamsburg or in Jerusalem in Meish Arm. It was a community that was specifically there to service and to be there for the wider Jewish and non-Jewish communities as well. My parents are involved in a lot of humanitarian work, whether that's not just to the Jewish community, that's to the Sydney community as a whole. So there was a sense of having my identity as belonging to this very beautiful and arcane tradition, and being on a purpose, being on a mission to share this message with others. There was very much this sense that my life was filled with this purpose that I'd received from my tradition to share the tradition with others. It was very so in that sense, it was very empowering and very beautiful. On the other hand, it also did make me an other and an outsider, right? Because I'm here on this mission from on high, geographically from New York, to share with you this wisdom of the Chabad tradition. And then going through these teenage years of discovery, it was about re-examining my own truths and my own tradition, what I had been taught, trying to find them, meaningful for my own, instead of just carrying on the inertia that I'd received from my childhood.
Right.
And in that process, I really discovered like that there were mysticism in other traditions, which was really, really bizarre because, I didn't even know that there was a term mysticism. Studying Chabad Hasidut retrospectively now, I know that most scholars characterize it, rightfully so, I believe, as mystical. I didn't even know that there were other streams of mysticism within Judaism. Vaguely, you know that there was a movement of Kabbalah and this and that, but you don't really study it much at all. Right. Within Chabad, we don't even study other Hasidic traditions. So we don't study the Hasidut of Ger, Satmar, Bav, Tzanz. There's so many other streams, and that's kind of all. There's really one way, and this is the highway to God, and that's it. So this process of opening myself up to other mystical traditions, to reading amazing Christian mystics and Sufis and Hindus and Buddhist thinkers, and just really opening myself to the full spectrum of these thinkers, getting into initially the perennialists, Huxley and James and Underhill, and then getting more into the scholarship of people that are doing serious work and questioning some of these easy narratives about mysticism. So I spent the next few years really diving into this as a topic. A lot of early Christian mysticism was very interesting to me. The idea of the human becoming God, what that means, what that theological idea means to the Christian mystics of the potential of the human, of every human to be deified. And then looking back at my own tradition and seeing how these universal ideas were really there all along in the language that I'd be reading, I just didn't have the key to open them up for them to be meaningful to me. And somehow, by studying the other world's religions and traditions, I received the key to begin to make sense of my own and slowly come back to my own religious experience, theory, and practice.
That's beautiful.
And most lately, there's been the aspect of that I feel like I've discovered something so beautiful and something so rich and something so good that I feel compelled to simply share it with people. If someone comes across like just a song that just floors them, just knocks their socks off, or a piece of artwork that just shatters their paradigms, the natural human instinct is to share that.
Right. Look at the light. Look at the beauty.
And that's what I feel. Yeah, that's what I feel. So trying to remain like level-headed and not manic about it and not crazy, like, oh my God, you guys need to, but like to be slow and to be methodical.
I knew I could relate to you.
Critical. Yeah, exactly. So in our conversation, the sense that you had discovered something which was profound and beautiful and mesmerizing, and you felt that you needed to share it, and the fear and the trepidation, the whole internal struggle around sharing that, is something which I very much felt with this very large journey of mysticism. It's a bit less, I think, personalized than your journey was, where for you it was your discovery. Here I feel like I'm just tapping into something which thousands and tens of thousands of humans have come to know through the ages, that which cannot be said. And basically,
actually, that's a nice segue into, because mysticism, that seems like that could mean lots of different things. So one of the things I definitely wanted to sort of, unlayer the onion of mysticism, as it were. And so maybe it's some way we can weave into that, because I think that's a really fascinating topic of conversation.
Yeah, I'm really happy to try and open up that word, because I think that it's a word that has a lot of potential as a word and as a label. I think it's a word that also has a tremendous amount of misunderstanding. There's a joke in the field that there are as many definitions of mysticism as there are scholars of mysticism. Um, there's now a new tendency in the past decade or two to reject the label as a whole. And that's move away from universal conceptions to particularity, which has importance. I'll give you.
Actually, there's probably some parallels there with psychology in my field.
Oh, yes.
Figure out what it was, and then like screw it. It's a word you'll never define it.
That's right. I think there are a lot of parallels here, and I think that when we try to define things as broad, they become sometimes a weight around our neck, and sometimes we just want to throw them away. But I think the quest that you were after of like, what is psychology and what really grounds it metaphysically, what's really going on here, for me is also very important with mysticism. And I'm not willing to let go of the word, because I think that there is a truth that lurks behind the word, which is worth hanging on to.
All right. Can you share a little bit about how that unfolded and that journey? And that, I'm curious, I know what you've said in relation, but I'm really curious for us to dive into that truth.
Yeah. So I think part of the challenge with articulating it is that classically one of the trademarks of mysticism, and this goes back to William James and others, is that it is ineffable. It's that which cannot be spoken. And sometimes when it comes to defining things, we're less apt as humans to be able to give exact descriptions of a thing. But when we see it, we know it, right? And I feel like that's often the case with mysticism. But being that we are here to talk and to use our words constructively, we can talk a bit about definitions that have been shared, and one particular definition that I've gravitated towards because I think it's very helpful. A definition that's been given, one which I like a lot, from Evelyn Underhill. She was a great Anglican scholar of Christian mysticism. She wrote a book called Mysticism, which is charting the journey of the individual mystic through the dark night of the soul. A very fascinating early work on mysticism. A field which a lot of women scholars play an important role in developing, which is quite interesting. Grace Jansen, Evelyn Underhill, among others. She writes that mysticism is the art of union with reality, or unity with reality, the art of uniting with reality, which is really well worded, a really scholarly. It's a beautiful wording as well, but it's really carefully worded. That it's an art. It's about uniting, and the thing which we are trying to unite with is with reality itself. That's Underhill's. That's her one line. Most scholars, when they talk about mysticism today, they talk about the perceived experience of the individual.
Actually, let's just pause with that, because I think you're absolutely right. That just struck. I just felt that, actually. I felt that definition. I hadn't heard you exactly phrase it that way, and it hit me. The art of uniting with reality. That's a very, very, and I would think, and I had to learn this because, I come from the science side of the equation and everything. You hear the term mystic, it's almost the exact opposite that you can kind of, it's like the word metaphysics. I always used to associate the word metaphysics with all this, woo or whatever, right? And then it's like, actually, fundamentally, it's the conforming of the self to reality at its most fundamental, non-dual, unifying place, and to do it in being itself and the art of being itself in a particular way. And that's like, talk about like that, instead of going up, talk like kind of going down, that's amazingly cool in terms of that frame. So I just wanted to hold that for a second, because I can appreciate and taste the beauty of that.
Yeah, I think I've also become so we become immune to our own words sometimes, and I'm so often sharing these definitions that I don't stop to allow them to really hit me the way they did the first time. And definitely when I read that the first time, it just hit me so strong, which is why it sunk itself into my consciousness. And I've read hundreds of definitions, and the beauty of it and the conciseness of it, and that point exactly, that it's not about escapism, right? I think we use these words particularly in this particular way. We talk about spirituality or a spiritual quest as something which is opposed to materialism, spirit, matter. That's the original binary, and mysticism in Underhill's phraseology and others is not about spiritual. It's not about running away to the top of the mountain. It's about uniting. It's about coming to reality in its realest and deepest, which is why so often a lot of my work is actually just crusading against the overemphasis on experience, on transcendence, on the escape, which is part of the galaxy of mysticism. but it's not. It's mysticism is about coming back down. It's about integrating. Is about getting beyond any of those binaries and separations.
Wow.
So I appreciate you stopping to pay attention to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Just, I guess I was tasting it like you did for the first time, and I just wanted to, to honor that. So thank you for sharing that, because it definitely it hits me in a particular kind of way that opens and pulls me. So that's cool.
That's really good. I'm really glad to hear. Yeah, the second definition, which I like to share, following Underhill's, is more from a more recent scholar, which is slightly less poetic, but a bit more fleshed out and really encapsulates the field well, I think. So this is from Peter Moore, M-O-O-R-E. He writes that mysticism is three things. He says, bracketing two other things, which is the ontological claim and the sociological sort of study of it.
Okay.
It's these three things. It's the experiences, I should say, plural, theories and practices of unity. So unit of experiences, unit of theories, and unit of practices. And it's such a great framing, and I'm happy to get into all of his categories.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, I always talk about theory, practice, and research, and really, sort of the empirical, and you can define empirical a lot of different ways. And then, the embodied in practice, and then the theoretical, conceptual, description, explanation. It sounds immediately like there's some real parallels there. And then to, coalesce that, bracket the sociological and the ontological, and then bring that together. That's fascinating. That's another beautiful definition. And the other thing, of course, that I saw with you that I hadn't appreciated at all is just how foundational this issue of observer, non-dual unity is with reality in a particular way in mysticism. I just said somehow I'd missed that fact. And so here's another, echo of that with more richness and facets to it in a particular kind of sort of intellectualized way. But that's great.
Yeah. I think it's really, it's not just a good definition, it's a powerful definition in that it allows us to then examine things through that three-part rubric, and see it in that way. It's really a powerful tool. And there's a lot more details about what are the varieties of experience, what are the varieties of theories, and what are the varieties of practices. And he splits them into a few categories, which we can share. But that notion that that unity is really central, that the central metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical proposition of the mystic across cultures and across ages is this realization of the fundamental unity, interconnectedness, interdependence, or non-duality, constitutional to reality. Sometimes we often speak about it as the breakdown of the subject-object dichotomy, which is our most basic dichotomy. What we talk about that sometimes in terms of psychology as an ego death, where the sense of separate self falls away. We feel one with all existence. There's in Christian mysticism, we talk about a term called unio mystica, the mystical union with the divine. In Jewish mysticism, we talk about dveikut, is typically the term, the cleaving, the clinging, the uniting with God. In Islam, we talk about fana, the annihilation, which leads to baka, to standing with God. So this is really, I think, when I think about mysticism, I think about it predominantly as this exploration of unity, which is obviously where the name of the channel comes from. There are people, to be fair, scholars and historians who define mysticism otherwise, and that's an ongoing conversation, and I'm not trying to close out any of that, but this is simply where I feel guided by the research and by the data.
Super resonant, man, in terms of, both just the disclaimer, because I always do that with psychology. You try to create a definition and then you get institutional, like who owns stuff, right? And they have to be, so I appreciate that. And it's an important, it's not just a caveat, but, and at the same time, if you're going to then grab a hold and make some claim. Here's the other association I was having in parallel. And so, in my system, unified, obviously, unified theory of knowledge. So I have framed my own structure of exploration through what I then called the problem of psychology, which is, hey, you can't define this. And then backed up recently, and so is the unified theory of psychology, and it becomes unified theory of knowledge. And that I made the shift with modernity, you get what I label the enlightenment gap. Okay. So the enlightenment gap is two sides of a broken coin, as it were. One side is the mind-body problem, like in all of its facets. Like once we built physical science through, say, Galileo into Newton, then what the hell was mind in relationship to that? And we never solved that, hence our mind-body problem. Subject-object is an epistemological facet of that very complicated problem. And then you also have, what is science relative to society? Okay. And I point to the modern versus postmodern divide. And you can also go back to traditional knowledge systems to see where the hell does science fit in relationship to our customs in the past, and who has authority in the future, and the justice issues. Okay. So the Enlightenment gap is the failure for us to generate a synthetic philosophy that affords us coherence, intelligibility, comprehensiveness in relation to our knowledge systems around mind and body and science and society. Okay, leaving us fragmented and pluralistic and having a meaning crisis, to put it in John's terms. So the idea, I think, it's what's so enlightening to me as a scientist when I hang with you. It's like, oh my God, this gap I identified, that's the epicenter of mysticism as you see it. So that's to me, that's a fascinating intersection.
Yeah. I mean, I think as humans, we tend to create these gaps inevitably, right? And we create that gap between form and matter, between mind and body, between subject and object, between the particularly universal. We create all these gaps. We characterize. One of the first acts that, according to the biblical myth, the biblical story, that Adam does in the Garden of Eden is he begins to name things, begins to give categories and distinctions.
In the beginning, there was the word, or the logos.
That's right. That's right. And as important as the word is, and the same way that the word can unite, we also create these gaps, these separations. And I think that the mystic has this like almost childlike realization that, wow, all of these characterizations and all of these gaps and all these separations are really secondary, are really just constructed. They're really just overlaid on a reality, which is one huge teeming, buzzing organism that is entirely interconnected. And once we can get into the non-distinction that really lies at the core of things, and sometimes that's done, metaphysically and ontologically, looking at how being is that which unites all. Sometimes it's done more scientifically and organistically, looking at the systems of things, how they all are interchanged. Sometimes it's done through a linguistic analysis of seeing how words themselves are. And what we find is that things are really, really deeply related, and the only difference is one of gradation. There's one of that between what we consider aberrant and normal. There's a million shades to get us there, and therefore to create any real gap, it's like, oh, here is one thing and here is another thing, and they're totally ontologically split from one another. I think that's the basic realization of mystic, is that's just not what reality is. Right. We can understand that those are the frames that we place on reality. But reality itself seems to them to be really, really one and united. And then there's what we talk about as the mystical experience, or the peak experience, or the altered state of consciousness, where one actually has the deepest sense of that's reality. Right. And I think that's a really strong driver to that way of thinking.
Yeah, John helped me with John Vervaeke with some language on grabbing the self-world grip, the intuitive perspective that we hold. That's not necessarily linguistic, but then when we enter transcendent states, it's the evolution of that grip in a particular way that then transforms the interrelations of our understanding and when they're revealed that way, gives this great opening of the self-other world relation. And then leaves people with the sense that this is, wow, ontically real at some level. This is not just some weird delusional state. I've actually reached a higher plane of understanding or conformity of understanding to reality, and ultimately really dissolving almost the self-world relation.
Yeah. I think also what's really important here to mention is that one of the oldest truths that mysticism discovers and teaches in many, many traditions. And this goes back actually to the etymology, the source of the etymology of the word mystic, which comes from the Greek mystikoi, which initially means to close one's eyes or mouth. And later came to refer to the initiate of the Greco-Roman mystery religions. Initially, and this is 2,000 years before Plato and Aristotle. The most well-known is the myth of Eleusis, the cult of Eleusis and Dionysus, where there would be this pilgrimage to a sacred place. We're not exactly sure what would happen there, because they were forbidden, the initiate was forbidden on punishment of death to reveal what they'd experienced.
Wow.
But we know that there was some sort of revelation of the divine. There was a theophany that they experienced. There was a sense that we have a letter that a historian writes back to his wife. He's like, I can't tell you what happened, but all I can tell you now is that, like, I'm no longer afraid of death, for I know it is just an illusion. Like that's something which they come to learn. And everyone who's anyone goes to these myths, and they happen annually for 2,000 years. The only time there's a break is during the Peloponnesian Wars. So if we think about how central these are to society as a whole, to the whole, Western tradition which we come from, we think that we come from simply, the term that's thrown around, which is a strange term, is the Judeo-Christian background. But we have to think of ourselves coming from the Euclidean, the Eleusidean and Dionysian background. The Polonian, like that's really in some sense where the society which we find ourselves in has its birth and has its roots. But what the real important point that which I want to emphasize is that there's a sense of the initiate means one who dies, goes through a liminal space where they're neither dead or alive, and then comes out of the other side reborn. And I think that's a really, really important point, which holds true today and holds true for so many traditions, that there's two sides of the coin here. We begin with just our conception of self as separate from the arena, separate from world. Then there's some sort of death, some sort of nullification, some sort of ego death, ego death. And that can be through 1,000 things can precipitate that. There's theories now that what was happening back then, there was a mix of psychedelics and mantra and fasting and all sort of these psychosomatic effects to achieve that. And then what happens on the other side is a rebirth, a new self that comes up from the other side. And that I think that the mystic, as the one who goes through that initiation, to lose themselves so they can find their true self, I think is also really integral to the definition. And I think we see that in many of the ways that we frame the experience of the mystic. There's two sides. So in Islam, there's fana followed by baka. In Judaism, there's bitul followed by dveikot. In Christianity, there's sometimes spoken of crucifixion followed by resurrection. And there's sort of this two side, the need to let go of who we are, to be reborn into who we really are, that need for real transition, for real change, for death of the former to before the rebirth of the latter. And we see in nature that the seed, the metaphor that I think the most beautiful metaphor is that the seed itself needs to rot and decay before it can sprout into something new. Beautiful. So that I think that's also really central to the idea of the mystic.
And the alignment of that with like the synergy between John and I and the cognitive science and unified theory at a scientific level is really, really profound. So, I mean, we just did the elusive I, which is with Christopher Maester Petru, who, brought an existential angle, but we were talking. So John's model of the self overlaps with what I would call the experiential self. This is the primate, perspectival, participatory part of ourselves. And then he creates a cognitive science, and then there's the whole existential aspect of that. The unified theory, the first key insight that I had in 1996 provides an evolutionary structure function analysis of the ego as the system of justification, and basically with propositional knowing. What happens is we then have propositional modes of communication, which is great, but at the same time, it creates the problem of justification, which is, well, what the hell is legitimate, and question answer dynamics. And that's a real network of problems to create that this whole system opens up. So then you build your system of justification in relationship to that. And what we're really talking about is how that is necessary to build to become a person. But if you actually want to transcend the narrow constraints of legitimizing and truth, and this is true because this is, whatever you get socialized into, that constrained train of a child that's trying to learn concrete operations of what really is, you then actually need to wake up in relationship to that. And the layers of waking up, and I see the mystics as realizing, oh my God, it's a trans-justificatory, participatory view of the whole that drops the ego back and then rebirths the experiential self with this new perspectival, much broader perspectival frame. And I would say the number of systems that see that in the various aspects, from various perspectives and various language, but have that as a fundamental core, it's amazing.
Yeah, what's really great about this whole new dynamic, these conversations that are happening, is that neither of us have the chance to study every field of human knowledge that's ever been written, but you have John, who's really, really, really cornering a lot of cognitive science, psychology, and you have you bringing in the world of psychology, and we have other people bringing in their own traditions. What happens is we're able to then see how when we bring these things into relation to one another, they begin to click and to fill in these puzzle pieces that begin to map out something much more comprehensive and complete. And that's a really, really exciting thing. And the notion that you're speaking about now about the developmental growth, I think something which John really put nicely is that the same way, and this is a metaphor which is used in Eastern mysticism already, that the same way that there's a transition from the child to the adult, and we have to go through the processes which you're speaking about evolutionarily and individually, so too there's the transition from the human to the sage. And in some sense, it's coming back to the child on a new level. It's spiraling back at a higher level. And that's a really cool thing to look at that developmentally and to see what's happening in our own cognitive and perspectival processes to make that transition. I think
the transformational experiences really are essentially designed that. So you get your conventional ego personhood that's justifying the world in whatever language affords their propositional know that, right? And then all of the transformational stuff really is about jolting that. You study stuff and then you jolt the hell out of it, right, John? And then all of a sudden that can no longer, you put it in a system either through hunger or psychedelics or chanting in the woods somewhere or all combinations, right? And all of a sudden, whatever that justification system is not up to the task. And you afford them the opportunity for the perspectival self-will gripping intuition to emerge. And if that can collectively come together, then all of a sudden, what you're doing is you're pulling that perspectival knowledge into a totally different out-of-body experience, out-of-egoic experience, right? And then you're like, wait a minute, and now you have a totally different transcendent, trans-justificatory perspectival shift, and then people come back, and now then the everyday life, well, how do I put that together? The justifier comes back online and is like, well, what the fuck does that mean? And it's a really fascinating, but that's in terms of cultivating the capacity for a sage mentality or higher transcending, including consciousness. I think that perspective on what is actually happening from sort of a scientific analytic way is really lining up deeply with these traditions in a very exciting way.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to think about the processes and the modalities. And I know that's something a passion of yours and John, of thinking about what's actually going on here, evolutionarily and individually. And the model that I think these are all models to play with and grapple with. I want to provide perhaps an alternative way of thinking. A lot of and these aren't mutually exclusive necessarily, and there could be many triggers and many processes that go on here. But what I hear is that you're speaking more about the disruptive processes that John likes to speak about, that there's some sort of shock to the system. I think that might be another way of looking at this. And I'm curious to hear what you think about this, which is that instead of it coming from a place of disruption or threat to the present system that then allows us to leave ourselves and to find something new, where like we're escaping, the burning house or the flooding ship, there might be another possibility where the ego and the justification system that we employ as part of that is a survival mechanism, right? So that we can flourish and we can know how to lie when we need to, and we cannot be eaten by the tiger, and we cannot be hit by the bus. There might be a place where not a place of discomfort and agitation, but a place of deep comfort and ease, a place of deep belonging where we feel comfortable to let go of ourselves, and we feel safe that nature, that God, however frame it, will hold us in its embrace when we let go of ourselves. It could be that's another way where the ego feels safe enough to step away from its survival needs to continue to justify and to separate itself and to watch out for itself. But we can, and maybe in psychedelics, one of the triggers where we're able to just so fully release and breathe into it, and from that place of ease and comfort and away from the threats, that we can come to see ourselves be like, oh wow, I really am, participating at one in this symbiotic relationship with the trees around me, with the people around me, with the cultures around me. They're not threats. They're not others, not enemies. That may be another, I'm curious.
100%. Yeah, no, that's completely complementary. In fact, to just add some language. So when you're talking about the embodied sort of sense of being present, that's a facet of the embodied experiential self. That's sort of that animalistic, intuitive, but can be super sophisticated. There's a rich mental life of intuition here. In fact, I talk about the sort of in a Platonic sense, there's the loins and the gut that embody you, and then the heart. And what the heart fundamentally is really about is that self-world relationship intuitively. And the ground of that heart relationship is the attachment system. Okay. And the attachment system is fundamentally anchored to a sense of security versus insecurity. All right. For these to be effective transformations, you can blow up the justification system, but ultimately the system better get recalibrated at the secure base of the experiential self and then regrow from that. Or else, I would argue, you're probably going to have a bad transformational experience. If you stay in the matter of insecurity, you will be then surrounded by the images of hell, essentially, because now all of a sudden the darkness will be all around you and your heart's going to freak the crap out. And then it's going to be like, get me out of here.
This is what we call a bad trip.
A bad trip, right? And so the issue absolutely is, so it's it's a connection between the pre-justificatory and trans-justificatory element that is coherently unified. So we're going to talk about down and up. Well, it's down and up in relationships. And it's like the Tao is not the Tao. It's getting away from the excessive reliance on propositional knowing, which I think modernity really, overdoes. And then the capacity to then feel in the heart, down to the body, down to the ground of being itself, and above in divinity. That it's that unity that really then, when people feel the grip above and below, that's that transformative kind of experience. So
I think the above and below language is very helpful, and I think this is something which we touched on earlier, that the sage and somehow is back to the child, right? Because there is at least one conception of the child, and as the child is that which is carefree, is that which does not have this fully developed sense of self, or it's self-conscious about how others are seeing behavior. It's not overly propositionalized in relation to reality, not overly engaging in justifications, theories, and systems. And in that sense, we definitely speak a lot about the mystic, the simplicity of the child, the innocence of the child, the forgiving of the child is ideals which are all held up by many mystical traditions. The sense that also even earlier, the child in the womb is seen as the paradigm of the mystic, enwombed by reality, where where all their needs are met, and it's a place of comfort and tranquility. There's a Freudian idea, even Freud actually dismisses mysticism as simply the desire to return to the womb. You can see how Freud would get very excited about that. And what was termed the oceanic experience. He says it's simply the desire to go back to the womb. And in some sense, in his cynicism, there is some truth to that, because there is a sense that we have when we're born into birth itself. There's some study now around this, which you probably know better than me. Birth itself is quite a traumatic experience, right? You're exiting, and there's a whole new paradigm of existence. You're now breathing, and there's light and sensation, and there's a lot of birth trauma, which has now become a hot topic. But the sense that we once felt, right, when we were in the womb, that everything was somehow part of us or an extension of us, or there to protect us. There was no threats, no enemies. Everything was surrounded by us. There's the sense that the human wants to go back to, and this loops back to biblical narratives of the return to paradise, the return to Eden, where everything is. And the question then becomes, and this is something which people like Ken Wilber have studied, is what is the difference between the child, the babe, and the saint? And he speaks about the pre-trans fallacy, that sometimes when we think that we're going to the stage of the saint, we're really just regressing to the child. And he talks about the essential difference, as far as I understand it, is that while the child is in that place of serenity and acceptance and non-egoicness, and they're not worried about their career and their image and their followers and everything, they don't necessarily have the full capacity to be present to the concerns of the other. The notion and relationality of the child can sometimes be underdeveloped, which is why we see children not intending to be malicious can hurt another baby or will take something away, and there's that sense. And so the saint is really the person who was able to have all of those qualities of the child with the fully developed respect of the other, even being aware of the participatory or illusory nature, however it's described, but being aware that the other has needs and wants and desires and hopes and fears, just like the self. And that's really the process of being the sage, of being able to, the theory of mind, to know that there's someone else in existence who thinks and feels, and to care for them. I think that's really the sage child distinction.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's fundamental. The recapturing of the oneness is qualitatively different once you're your personhood, okay, right, and pre your personhood.
Right.
And we wouldn't it's a qualitatively different state, and the continuity and unity of that is absolutely a beautiful thing, and the capacity to hold that and frame that is absolutely beautiful. But the idea, and this Wilbur really nails this with pre and trans, is a qualitative difference between pre and trans. I'm on just a continuum, want full oneness, just go straight to a rock. The rock's unbelievably one at one level, right? So it's sort of really like, it's like, but that's, I don't think that's the state of complexified enlightenment and for me, then the sage position is then, creating a space of reception and broadcast function that then coordinates these higher levels of complexified systems. And that's another radical difference between babies, obviously don't do that. And that's fundamentally sort of what we need. So that resonance down, but difference between it being down and up, and holding that. And I think, I think Freud can see that from his dark psychoanalytic brew. And I do think that, I think that depth analysis is worth deep consideration. I think there'd be some truth to that. I think Wilbur brings a particular lens or a language to the pre-trans that allows us to, have categories pretty quickly to access the different similarities, but important, line of wholeness so that we can discriminate.
Yeah, I'm actually not surprised at all that Wilbur is someone who your thought has been gravitating to, being that you're both grand theorists. If that's a label that I can share. But yeah, I think it's really, I think there's the play between simplicity and complexity is a really interesting one. And then I think that when you look at different mystical traditions, they tend to emphasize sometimes one or the other, and I can think of some examples of that. There's a sense of in Zen, we speak a lot about the beginner's mind. There's a lot of emphasis on simplicity, and in Hasidic mysticism, in my own tradition, it has aspects which are very complex and very sophisticated metaphysics. And then there's also this emphasis on the beauty of the simple individual, the Pashat Yid, who in some sense reflects the simplicity of God. God in Jewish theology is called the Achdut HaPashut, the simple unity. So this relationship between simplicity and complexity is an interesting one. And I think that there might be, and this is a very good guess from within the field of mysticism, there might be a very good place where simplicity and complexity themselves unite and are no longer oppositional. That I would venture to see.
That's super resonant with my own frame. Inside that coin I gave you, it carries a lot of symbolism. One is unity, multiplicity, dialectic. It's also the coin itself. There it is. So on that one side, the one represents unity, and then I quad can then immediately then differentiate the unity with equivalence. And then it spreads out in all sorts of different ways. The actual path to that comes from what's called the equivalency, which at some point I'll explain to you. But essentially, the equivalency is a line I was able to draw through the tree of knowledge from observer to measurement to electromagnetic radiation, kinetic or electromagnetic radiation, that creates an equivalency across all of that. And electromagnetic radiation being the most fundamental, simple energy information there is, that then gets aligned with the more complexified energy information and creates an equivalency between there. And so that dialectic between fundamental simplicity and fundamental complexification in oneness and multiplicity is exactly embedded in that structure. So when I hear that, I'm like, man, that aligns pretty close. And in fact, that's wisdom energy. So energy being the most sort of fundamental kind of substance in the universe, and wisdom being the highest complexification form of that. And the continuity between all of that, that's a very, very strong line that I can hear in what you're saying and be like, man, that aligns very, very profoundly.
Yeah, I think it's incredible that I can make a speculation in my own field and then think of sort of references and models of it, and then immediately there's something within your system that lines up with that. I think that's the token of a comprehensive system. And also some sort of a indicator that maybe we are tapping close to something that models reality, in that things that I throw up and find place in your system too. I think that's a very interesting. Observation in and of itself. I think what's interesting though, and I like to emphasize this always when speaking about mysticism, that these three components we began with speaking about of experience, theory, and practice.
Yes.
And the theory there, I think, as you were mentioning in your own field, is particularly to try and make sense of what we experienced in the experience. Yep. Which is tricky sometimes to call experience. Many mystics and philosophers reject the term experience, but that's why I put it in air quotes. Mm-hmm. What we experience in the experience and what we know from everyday reality. And the theories are there to try and bridge those two things. And what emerges in the metaphysics and the theology typically is what's known now as the great chain of being. Arthur Lovejoy, the father of the history of ideas, wrote this book called The Great Chain of Being, mapping this metaphysical and an idea which Wilbur is very into as well, of course. Yeah. So attempting to draw a theoretical bridge between our experience and our everyday world to make sense of reality. And the third component is the practice. And I think this is important to mention all three. The practices are split into two by Moore, and rightfully so, I think. Okay. One is the practices which facilitate and afford us the experiences, right? Okay. We never deserve or own or create the experiences, but we can make ourselves receptacles for those experiences to chance upon us. And they're always felt to come from a place of gift and grace. That's the phenomenology across traditions. So the experiences which allow us essentially to work, if you want to speak about it as a scientist, to mess with our own mental processes and states and physiology, either to take it to a place of silence and quietness. I'm employing here some of the language from Robert Hood's scale of mysticism, where he charts this scientifically, either to a place of complete stillness and silence, where we slow down the mind, we slow down the body, and in that silence we hear that small silent voice speaking. Or he speaks about the other end of it, where we ramp things up. And this also maps so nicely to what we were saying before about disruption versus comfort, where we put things in such overdrive that it cascades into this insight, this realization. This might map onto John's hot and cool states of flow. Cool is bring ourselves down to. Totally. And then on the other side of practice is, and I think this might be actually, in my opinion, I think this is the most important part of mysticism, which is why I say it, is how we therefore act and live our lives in accordance with what we know and what we've felt and what we've seen. Beautiful. How do we act with ourselves first, with those around us, with the world around us, with the people around us? And the basic, this is a contended point, but to follow this line of the thinking, the basic point, if the experience is one of unity and the theories of those which try to make sense of unity in relation to diversity, of complexity in relationship to simplicity, then the question is, how do we act knowing that we are one with everything that we encounter and experience? And how do we treat those things? And essentially the point is that the same way that I identify with myself and therefore take care of myself and nurture myself and try to be kind to myself and make sure that I'm, well taken care of and sheltered and fed and all the basic Maslowian needs, that same imperative applies to all of existence, which I encounter because because my circle of identity is now expanded globally. And that basically is, as far as I understand it, and there are people who disagree, that is the ethic of mysticism. So that's, I feel very compelled to share that, because I think that unless the ethic is missing, right, we can get stuck in experience and we can turn into experience junkies. And that happens all too often. We can get stuck in theory and we can spend our lives as philosophers and theologians, which could be fun, but as well, I don't know how much good that does for the world. We can get stuck in simply practices and we can become, the most proficient in yoga or breathing or whatever it is. But unless we're going ahead and implementing these things outwards and choosing to live lives that are grounded in kindness and compassion and care, then I think the rest of it is just a waste of time.
Totally. No, that's wonderful. I mean, that's another thing I want to sit with in relation for a second, because to embody that is where it's at. Right.
Those are probably the hottest part of it, I think.
I mean, and right, and certainly knowing the phronesis, the wisdom of what to do when, but embodying that and doing and orient one's soul spirit towards that, I think fundamentally has to be the core, because that's the realization, use a John term, but that's the realization of goodness essentially at the level of, and to hear the juxtaposition of practice and theory and experience in a particular way. I'm also really, my psychotherapy side is really taking heart to that too. because, and I'm really heartened by what I struggled with so much in psychotherapy, which is so fascinating to listen to you talk about mysticism, is, I got channeled into modernity. Another thing I want to come back to is I think modernity is nightmarishly alienated to mysticism. And I want to see if you agree with that, potentially. And at least that's the backside of the 21st century. One of the healing things would be a restoration of modernity and mysticism that I want to propose to you. But before I do that, I want to then say why I would say that in relation to my own career. Okay. So I get, my dad is a born again evangelical Christian, okay, for a while. He goes Methodist, gets born again, believes in the concrete realization of the evangelical truth of, Son of God and all of that. And then 10 years, over a 10-year period, that shining light of the concrete reality of that fades to the point where it's like he can't justify that in relationship to what he learned scientifically and everything else. And then what happens is that, it was all a Santa Claus belief system. It was all just, and so then he turns into a Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins kind of like, oh my God, this is all just BS, right? And so I think, and my dad and I have long now, especially as I evolved, and it's like, wait a minute, how you frame religion varies tremendously. If you frame the concrete Santa Claus version, then okay, but not everybody does that, So anyway, that's an aside, but I got then socialized into, science is what's true, okay? And we then go from what's propositionally true, and then we'll make pragmatic decisions about what is good, all right? So then I get trained, I say, I'm going to become a psychological scientist, psychological doctor. I get dropped into a system and then see all sorts of confusion in the real world. Because the real world's confusing, and it always will be, folks. Well, it's never the logic of your complicated analyses ain't going to sort out the confusion of the real world. But then, because of what I was socialized into, it's like, I better go to science because that's what's going to tell me the truth. But in so doing, notice what I then, and this was helpful for me in my logos path, but it's diagnostic, and this is why I got so excited in listening to you. It then basically meant, I'm going to separate out my values. I'm going to separate out my embodied being. I'm going to just ask the analytical questions of truth and relation. Okay. And that then prioritized that particular position and separated it away from embodied living and our values in a particular way. Yeah. And it essentially mirrored the success of physical science and technology and the capital production of reality and control of reality that modernity affords us and curses us with, And so anyway, but my journey in following modernity was to factor out actually the embodied real, the subjective, and the values, and then try to get to some analytic truth with really no real connection to practice. And while I got lucky and was able to then come back, the systems itself don't. And the idea of that unity is something that many psychotherapy try to aspire to, but they don't know how to. And so the idea of the mystic tradition being, at least in the version that you're espousing and embodying, living that is really actually, it's inspiring to me as a psychotherapist to listen to your narrative as a mystic in the mystic tradition.
Wow, I really appreciate that. I appreciate that deeply. That's very kind of you. I'm curious. I am fascinated by this dichotomy that you're posing between modernity and mysticism. And I would be curious to explore it with you. There's a whole modern tradition of mysticism, modern, not in the cultural sense, but in the simply temporally modern,
right,
contemporary, which takes modernity as its enemy. I mean, a lot of religious traditions do that. A lot of my own Jewish world that I belong to sees modernity as inherently bad. One of the slogans of a very large movement in contemporary Judaism is punning on an agricultural law from the Mishnah, Chadash Asur min Torah, that anything that's new is forbidden according to the Torah, according to Jewish wisdom. And that's a very strong position, a position which is not the position of my own tradition that I grew up in.
Right.
But outside of Judaism, there's a fairly well-known mystical movement, which is a branch off of perennialism. And they refer to themselves as the traditionalists. And that's people like Rene Guénon. There's people like Julius Evola, is more of the notorious member of that group. There's modern Lings, and Houston Smith identifies to some Ananda Swami. There's a couple founding fathers in that movement, and one of the mainstays of their thinking is simply a rejection of modernity. That what is old and traditional art, traditional music, traditional culture, traditional theology was good, and the modern period, they see it in cosmic terms, borrowing a term from Hinduism, the Kali Yuga, the dark, cycle, the dark night. I don't particularly have much sympathy, necessarily pick fights and make enemies, but I don't have much sympathy at all for the traditionalists, for their thinking, and I say that in respect, because these are men who studied a lot and practiced a lot and were very steeped in the traditions in ways that I may never be. But the assumed antipathy between modernity and mystical, I think is a mistake. And I think that the mystics of the past and of the present, of all ages and of all cultures, speak about, in fact, the atemporality of being itself, which is experienced in what they refer to sometimes as the eternal now, the endless present, and that present is not something which is experienceable or reachable just in some sort of traditional society pre-modernity. That now is now too, and that now transcends time and transcends change, and therefore definitionally must be available as well. And if anything, we can. I mean, these are all just narratives. These are all just frameworks, right? Do we choose to frame history as something which is moving in a procession of totally. Degradation, or do we choose to see history as progressing towards something? Do we see it as the unfolding that guys like Hegel did, or do we see history as not going in any direction, as in many modern scientific and postmodern conceptions? These are our choices of how we choose to see history. And the question is, the question for me is, and this is borrowing from someone like Richard Rorty, which conception of reality, of time, of history is going to be most beneficial for us living as flourishing, fulfilled human beings? Totally. Because to come with the hubris of saying we can tell you, we know with certainty what the nature of time and the nature, like that's a bit ridiculous. Like let's relax. Totally. But what model can we best choose to live with? And I think that with modernity, the reason why traditionalists and traditionalism is so scared of modernity, because modernity includes a lot of things. It includes the Enlightenment and modern science, the Industrial Revolution, and there's a lot of things. Modernity is a huge category for itself. But in one sentence to put it, and I'd be actually curious to know what you mean when you say modernity. But at least one way of putting it is to talk about the Nietzschean idea of the death of God. That what we took as absolutes, what we took to be the real, what we took to be ontologically sustaining of reality, and that's ethically and that's morally and metaphysically and theologically, is now just all out the window. And this is with Descartes, who, although coming back to God, says, let's reject all propositions, let's reject all the classics, all the ancients, all the scholasticism. The sense of we are here to start afresh, to start new, and everything from the past is gone. There's the death of God including everything that was before us. Totally. And I think that's what they're so terrified of. But I think, to loop back to something we were saying earlier, thank you for this letting me go on this extended rant.
Oh no, that's great.
The same way that developmentally the individual must die to go from being a child to being an adult, and from being an adult to being a sage, so too God must die. God meaning all our values, all our beliefs, all our conceptions, all of our metaphysics, our idea of God, our highest of all ideas, that has to die so that we can be reborn into a new, more complete, more adjusted, more relevance realizing conception of God, of the totality of existence. And I think that's happening. I think John's talk of non-theistic theism, or is that his expression? Religion after religion.
Religion that's not a religion. Yep.
These things are what modernity affords us if we allow ourselves to use this opportunity of the ashes of God to rebuild something better and kinder and more fulfilling and more enriching for everyone that lives on this tiny planet together. And therefore I see modernity as a challenge, but as a challenge of a space of death, of initiation, where we may come to something much stronger. And on some days I'm very optimistic that we are building something more beautiful together.
the advances of science and with the direction that psychology goes, and with the proliferation of people trying to be mindful and aware, and the growth of spirituality in today's society, or as positive things. And then on other days, I'm incredibly pessimistic, where I see what's happening with technology and with social media and with the devastation of the planet and with the neglect of the self and the other. So it depends which day you catch me on, but modernity, I don't see as something inherently good or bad. I see it as a challenge where the old is out the door, and the question is on us. What is the new that we want to usher in? Beautiful.
That's just put that up on a wall somewhere. That's a very nice narrative, and it spoke. I think it resonated with virtually everything. The only slight difference is just positioning our positions. So I critique modernity as really being inside of it and an exemplar of it in a particular way. So when I nudge it, I'm not nudging it from the traditionalist perspective that would then, get rid of it. I'm nudging it so I'm inside, it's part of my family. So I'm critiquing it from the inside view. And I couldn't. The life I lead and everything I feel so grateful for is built on the structures of modernity, the science that I, embrace. And so I can't look at modernity and say, oh, it's all shit, or else I would then be like, the fiber of my beings and what I've able to achieve is shit. What I do see, what I really meant was there's a hole in modernity, that I see mysticism, your version of mysticism is filling. And then that creates a completion in a particular world that affords us that marriage that can turn the back half of the 21st century more likely to be the positive side of that, of your rose-colored glasses than the dark-colored glasses that both my cells completely will feel from day to day, or sometimes even moment to moment in relationship to I see us on the cusp of heaven and hell at this moment. In time, in this kairos of moment in time, and why I get really energized to be like, wait a minute, I want to make sure that my practice and my little baton of energy is moving the meter to be more likely that we'll be good ancestors and turn this thing into something that's okay, as opposed to the potential pollution and danger of the threat. And the reason that as soon as I heard and saw the whole, it was like, oh my God, I can take Zevi's version of mysticism and put it in the hole that was in my modernity upbringing. The skepticism and the criticism and the arrogance of science and aspects of it. I bought a physicalist nihilism for a while. It's like, oh, we're just fucking, atoms bouncing around, and at least we can get hyper analytic studies to demonstrate that that's true. Okay, I mean, I used to sort of believe that. And that is sort of the authority of when I talk about modernity and its vacuity at the level of wisdom, that is part of the authority that it asserts. There's a reductive physicalism. You'll hear me and John battle about this all the time. You come from the science angle, you were always bitching about reductive physicalism, because that is seen inside the Propositional Academy as sort of the hardest nosed version of reality. Not that anybody really believes in it, but it's seen as sort of, and really it's actually defined against the excesses of the traditional Christian views in a Sam Harris sort of way that then it frames what those things in terms of their error, the concretized versions, childlike versions that then are claimed to be error. And then you grow up and realize you grow up and it's just physics, okay? It's like, no, actually, that growing up is a stunted development. It's actually in error, and it undercuts the wisdom of the ages. And if we're actually going to build an inclusive and transition phase that affords us a second enlightenment, I frame my system as like, I love the enlightenment, but a second enlightenment includes the developmental progression and transcends them in a Wilberian sort of way with effectiveness, with developmental growth toward the good and the capacity to reflect on that. So we embrace our primate selves. We embrace the word and the oral indigenous culture. We embrace the emergence of civilization and the great religious traditions, embrace science and what modernity did, embrace the postmodern critique of what it can't do, and then seek an integrated, pluralistic, holistic vision that can orient us toward the good in a sustainable, livable fashion, rather than being on this cusp of, oh God, how the hell is this thing going to go?
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. And I appreciate the perspective coming from inside, a scientific worldview. I feel the same way. When I speak about mysticism, I really try very little to invoke anything
that a contemporary scientist would have, would raise their eyebrow at. I very rarely invoke the notion of the soul, unless I'm talking about just a metaphor for the essence of a thing or an individual. But as a metaphysical reality, I don't invoke it. I don't invoke God metaphysically in the way of some, mind at large in terms of the God that's critiqued, the God that died, I think, with Nietzsche's pronouncement. I really don't invoke any of that. What I would like to see is that if within our system of molecules in motion, if we can still come to assert to the propositions that mysticism makes, and I think that's mysticism done best. And I think we can do that. And I think very simply, the way that we do that is we think about meaning propositionally, right? Because we're in this propositional cage. Yep. And we think that the answer to the universe is like 49 or something, right? And if we can come to that, or Jesus is the only son of God, like whatever the pronouncement, whatever the proposition is, like that is. But if we actually think for a second, meaning is something which is experiential, right? When we're doing something which we feel to be meaningful, right? There's an empirical sense that what I'm doing now is meaningful. And what we need to do is we need to reverse engineer that, not ask ourselves, what are the propositions which we can amount to and attain to, and we can profess that we are therefore in, correct adjustment with reality. And I have to proclaim that, fundamental to reality is love, bliss, and consciousness, or that God, whatever the proposition is, from as ancient to as modern, but instead look at what are the things that we do as humans, right? Yep. As these evolved primates that make us feel that we're doing something which is meaningful and fulfilling, and those are not very hard to figure out. I'll give you some clues. It's not when we buy a new Ferrari. It's not when we get, the raise a job and we outbid our competition. It's when we're engaged in things that unite us with ourselves, with our family, with the world around us, right? When we're in communion with nature, when we're tending to our children, and you can simply reduce a lot of these things to a survival, to evolutionary psychology that, you're trained like. Schopenhauer says that the only reason why we engage in sex against all of our best ideals is because the organism wants to, as a whole, wants to continue to reproduce, giving the sort of a bit of anthropomorphic teleology to survival, and therefore he says that the devil chuckles after the act of consummation. But I think that if we get beyond the criticism and the cynicism of that critique, we can see how all of the things which actually feel meaningful, they're not propositions, are things which we are engaging in, getting beyond the illusion of separation and getting towards our fundamental reality of oneness and interconnectedness. And me and John had some disagreement about whether we should then put that into propositional language and the value and the dangers of doing that. But bracketing that conversation for a second, the sense that we don't need to make any metaphysical, any religious, any spiritual claims, we can entirely use the tools of modernity and the tools of enlightenment. Most of my favorite philosophers are post-enlightenment philosophers. And from within that space, we can turn to ourselves, we can turn and ask ourselves genuinely, what is it that as humans feels meaningful? And this is not in some sort of absolute sense, it's not truth with a capital T. It's and then we can begin to piece together those things in our own lives and in the lives of the world, of the people around us. And my bet is that it's going to line up with a lot of the things that mysticism has been teaching and has been espousing. And I think that there is a possibility of framing mysticism, which is why I think it may be fitting well here, which is entirely scientific, entirely humanistic, entirely, extraterrestrial in its propositions. And it can be worked entirely ground up. And once we have that ground up foundation, we can then look back to the world's great mystical traditions, to the geniuses of the ages, from that place, and see how the words are coalescing and are aligning and are mirroring what we can discover in our own modern post-enlightenment scientific, even materialistic perspective.
Man, I completely agree with that. That's unbelievably brilliantly stated. I had so many different associations. Again, I just need to pause and metabolize them. But I just want to just double click on. So this is, once again, this is exactly my view. I mean, it's completely. So I'll come at it from the science side, because I couldn't help myself get distracted a little along those lines, because you mentioned evolutionary psychology. Actually, evolutionary psychology is my first scientific love when I shifted from psychotherapy. And the reason was because it afforded me a particular kind of perspective. And then I abandon it as it's in its academic form, not in its sort of like, oh, we're primates, but there's an academic form that I abandoned because it was way too narrowly structured from my vantage point. And here's the kicker that comes to what my system affords, and then especially hooked up with John, is essentially exactly what you're saying. Okay. And what I mean by that is it says that the nervous system is an investment value system. Okay. It's an investment value system. Okay. And what it's trying to do, if we add John's frame on it, is trying to engage in recursive relevance realization for the paths of investment. Okay. And then the ground of that is pleasure and pain. This is what we call valence qualia at the level of experience. And then if that's right, then the very essence of our experience is valence of good and bad. You know, and if that's the case, then that brings me to what Zach Stein would say is like, it's not that the human world is absence of meaning, it's drenched in meaning. We're drenched in meaning in a particular way. And I think that our experience is exactly that. It's why do people try to take heroin, for the love of Christ? It's the worlds are drenched in meaning that they're trying to, in this case, trying to escape from, because the insecure, demonesque experience of being is brutalizing, and they would rather, so the embodiment of experience at the subjective conscious experience level is calibrated by care, to use a Heideggerian term, and that care then manifests in terms of evolutionary cognitive behavioral neuroscience as basically pleasure and pain, which are the fundamental valence of our primate system that's telling us what's good. And the other thing I was going to say with that is, like, when I had my transcendent experience, I've had a few. I had one back in October or whatever, where I had this wisdom energy. I had an experience where I landed on wisdom energy as a fundamental concept, was bringing this high low together. I dropped out of propositional being, and I felt the metabolism of wisdom energy in my embodiment. And I wandered around I took my dog Benji and we'd go for walks and we'd just be in the neighborhood as a microcosm of existence in the cosmos, that just afforded. And there was I had the fundamental nonverbal experience of every cell in my being. This is a coherent, integrated state, that affords this is a little quasar of complexification that affords the intersection of potentiality in a particular light that is divine. And that is that to me. So the whole point is, yes, there's the valence organizational structure of complexification is very much oriented around this coherent integration across scale. And certainly, and then I first person experienced that thing. So anyway, that to me aligns, psychological science and the naturalistic ontology, and then dropping into this and be like, whoa, absolutely. I mean, I'm ground up meaning systems, or basically from the inside, this is a ground up meaning system. So the idea that there is no meaning just is a nonsensical assertion.
Yeah, there were two things that I really appreciate that you just said there. But besides for sharing your own experience, which is really beautiful, and it's really great to hear that, resonating again with people on a really deep level, where they see that firsthand, which is really incredible. Beyond the propositional, the notion that the integration happens on all levels, I think, is a very true point, experientially, phenomenologically, and mystically within the mystical systems, where there are these many layers of being. And on each of them, there can be this unification that happens. And we could talk about, the language in psychology of the different levels of self that can become integrated and connected. We can talk about the levels of societally, where we're able to be united within, and then with our closest relatives, and then with those around us, we can work that way. Metaphysically, we talk about different, stages of being or levels of soul. That's, I think, just another framing onto this. And each one of them has to be united at its own level. And that's something that we can feel. We can feel that integration, that participation, unification, running through those layers of being, and then uniting them, to use the spatial metaphor, uniting them, horizontally, and then reuniting them vertically, is which in some sense collapses the distinctions at all between those levels, where they're seen as all expressions of the same quasar. I like that term that you use there. That's one thing which is definitely there in many of the traditions. There was the final thing that you said, I wanted to respond to. I can't remember what it was or what I wanted to respond to now. Can't remember. Do you remember what the very last thing that you said was?
Let's see. And I was talking about wisdom energy near the end, and then the coherent integration. I did hit quasar. I had said something about drenched in meaning through Zach Stein before.
Oh, yes, I got it. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is the point which I wanted to make, which is that when we talk about the opposition between either being the world being totally vacuum and vacuous and void of meaning, right, or being drenched in meaning, these two sides you're putting out here, I think that I understand that what you're saying is not drenched in meaning propositionally, but drenched in meaning experientially. But when people hear that, I think they still think propositionally, which is why I think it's important to emphasize that from a propositional standpoint, mystical traditions will emphasize the equivalence of entirely meaningless and entirely meaningful. And I think this is a point which is borne very well by Buddhist philosophers, by Nagarjuna and others, a topic which John knows more about than I do, I think, where they embrace a real metaphysical, a real propositional meaninglessness, that there is no reason for anything, that the point of existence is just existence itself doing its thing with no point in mind. There's no telos at all. Right. You know, there's a famous, I think this might be from the Diamond Sutra, famous sutra where in Buddhism, where the Buddha is trying to choose the next leader, you know, after he's finishing his time in his physical manifestation. And he has all of his like head disciples in front of him, and he's giving his last sermon. And the sermon is he pulls out a flower and holds it up, and only one of his students says, aha, they have like this relevance realization, to use John said. They have this enlightenment. And obviously there's many different interpretations within Buddhism, but at least one which particularly encapsulates this idea is the realization that life itself is just the blossoming of the flower. The flower blossoms for no particular reason. It just is, it just does its thing. And in the embrace of the full propositional meaninglessness of that experience, can we come to the full empirical meaningfulness of feeling, of being in the presence of simply that awe and beauty and grandeur and unfolding of life in the pretty and the ugly, in the grotesque and the mysterious, without needing to think of any. And I think this is a point which was stressed very, very repeatedly and heavily and eloquently by Alan Watts, who really wanted to, because we have this notion in Western society that there needs to be a reason, there needs to be a point. Why am I doing this? What's the point of this? What am I trying to get at? Which has its place, but embracing the parallel to that, which is that we're just doing this because this is the way that being itself is unfolding with no reason, no purpose. And that is such, ironically or non-ironically, that is such a meaningful place to be experientially. Right.
Exactly. I love that. Yes, I'm glad we were able to find that because that certainly speaks to, because we're stuck in this propositional capital M meaning. Is it there? Is it not there? If it's there, then everything has a reason, or this then tells you what you ought to be, and then it tells you how to view life. It's like, no, that's not quite right. And then, okay, well, then if it's not there, then everything is meaningless. It's like, no, that's not quite right. It's something adjacent to that. And I think the way you just articulated that potential adjacency, or however we want to frame that, is exactly resonant with it. That's an interesting, the way that's wrongly framed can ironically flip us into perhaps a right relational framing of that question.
Yeah. Something about getting beyond this binary of meaningful and meaningless.
Right. And the propositional, right, the relating to it propositionally. Is at least, especially at some sort of scripted level that then feeds back in a normal propositional sense to justify,
I think there's nothing quite as dangerous as people who really believe that they have the propositional, meaningful truth of reality, and are willing to do whatever it takes to spread that message. We know that that might be the most dangerous thing. Who was the comedian who says that religion may not make bad people do good things, but it can certainly make good people do bad things. So moving beyond that fixation with a propositional meaning, I think is going to be a very healthy step for humanity at large.
Totally. I really, like you said, in fact, that, I begin with agnosticism at the ultimate level, agnostic about the ultimate nature of reality. Right? It's sort of like, what the hell? And then, so you have epistemic humility at one level, and then, a pretty strong statement that anybody has fundamental God's eye, capital T, absolute truth, eternal and propositional of the way the world is. Sorry, I'm out.
For your own health and safety, stay away from such a person.
Yeah, that's dangerous. So I start with agnosticism, and then I'm sort of atheistic in the traditional sense of just without belief in a personal God that I can make metaphysical claims about, reflecting back. And then I've become enamored with this term syntheism, which is my friend Alexander Bard coined. Well, he didn't coin it, but he wrote a book on it. It's basically, in my language, is belief in the concept of God. So, and then, particularly the God of light, or to create, in John's terms, sort of utilize that for a divine double of what the world ought to be, or what it could become, or what's its potential, or what would be sort of the sage, the idealized sage in relation to create that particular kind of is actual ought space of relation, to then, ask me questions about, hey, am I acting in right relation to that kind of concept?
Right.
So for me, that's the way I sort of structure sort of epistemic humility into, well, actually, then there are claims. There's a metaphysical one-worldness claim, but that metaphysical one-worldness does require a particular kind of position, wisdom, mystical, sage kind of position in relation, and that feels to me to afford the guidance and structure, for being in the world.
Yeah, I think everything you just framed there, which is really really well put. I appreciate the conciseness of that formulation. This is very much the way that I see the mystics operating. Ontologically, metaphysically, and epistemologically, where they begin with a place of deep humility, epistemological humility, which is so important, where they acknowledge and continue to acknowledge throughout their intellectual careers that all that we can know is that we don't know, right? To quote both Socrates and the Zohar. And then I think their God is highly non-theistic. I think there are many formulations of mysticism which are downright atheistic, in the sense of rejecting the God, which is some sort of, man in the clouds that can answer our claims and strike our enemies. The mystics, by and large, have no time for such a God. And then embracing some sort of idealistic proposition, as you said it, of the unity of being. I think what you formulated is really a formulation of the way that I try to think through mysticism myself, beginning with as few assumptions as I can, and working ground up, working empirically and rationally to come to that model, and to realize that even that model is just a model, and it's a model which we can employ to because it feels right, and it makes sense, and it does afford ways of living that are beautiful and that are harmonious and are peaceful and allow us to flourish. But even to remember that even those propositions, ultimately are just propositions and constructs, and which is so important, because it leaves room open for mystery and for wonder and for awe. I think that the same way someone that can be a religious fundamentalist and dogmatic about their theism, people can do that with their mysticism too. They could say, "Oh yeah, this is my dogma," and they can be really dangerous about it. They can be obnoxious about it. Remaining deeply open to the fundamental mystery of reality, and mystery exists when we're not able to pin it down. There's a great line from the Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran. He says that doubt is too lonely a feeling to know that faith is its twin brother. This notion that the space where doubt and faith can interplay, where knowledge and humility and ignorance can coexist, is a really rich place. And I hear that from your work as well, which I deeply appreciate.
Beautiful. There was one other thing I had on my little agenda to at least we touch on. I'm aware all of a sudden it's an hour and a half in, Zevi. I thought we were like, I didn't realize how fast this is. That's always a good sign. I'm always like, well, if time's going, time flying. But maybe we could at least help or offer, if you would be willing to offer some narrative about where you are now and where you're headed. I'm really curious as to what it's been to build the Seekers of Unity YouTube channel. What kind of the feedback that you get? Who are you connecting with? So where are you? What's your kind of more pragmatic narrative trajectory there, and that what you're offering the world through, at least through the YouTube channel?
Yeah, no, time is definitely fun. That's a great question. I'll tell you a bit about where where it's been till now and the reception of it and things. Where it's going from now, I really have no idea, which is again embracing that mystery of where things go. If I knew where it was going, it would be boring.
Yeah.
Initially, so I'd spent time initially teaching within the Orthodox Hasidic Jewish world, teaching Jewish mysticism, teaching Hasidut, Kabbalah, classic Jewish texts. My background is in Jewish, thought, Jewish textuality, literacy, history. That's really my bread and butter. And I was teaching that at different levels. I was teaching young adults and teenagers and a variety. I've taught in a few countries. Part of the movement which I grew up in has a very strong ideal on giving back to the community and going to remote places to share. So I taught in Cape Town, I taught in Melbourne, I taught in Northern Israel, all over. When my thinking began to move more into a universalistic direction, there became a rift between what I was teaching and what I was thinking. And it became challenging because I'm a person who values, integrity and intellectual honesty. And so I wanted to say what I actually believed, but then I also knew that what I was believing wasn't necessary. I knew the theology of the institution that I was teaching for, and I knew that they wouldn't want those messages necessarily being shared. And there's also therefore a responsibility of representing what you're being paid to represent. So that was a rift growing within me. So when it came to adult education, that was easier because I could teach a class, teach classic sources, classic positions that I knew that the institutions would be cool with, and then I would say, okay, the hour is over. I'm no longer on the books. I'm no longer your teacher, rabbi. Here is me. I'm just an individual seeker now. If you want, we can talk. And that's the way that I split it up. When I was teaching teenagers, that was a bit more difficult because morally and legally, you're not allowed to tell kids whatever religious things you believe if they're within a religious framework, and their parents are hoping and paying and trusting you to teach them one thing. There are moral and maybe legal issues of teaching them otherwise. So these were challenging things, and eventually it led to a rift where I really had to step away from teaching and go on my own to explore, to figure out what this message was. And I spent a long time, a few years almost, in not a proverbial but in a literal cabin in the woods. Just reading with very little social contact, and just really trying to make sense of these things and put together a picture and put together an image of reality. And I know these are probably stories and narratives which you resonate with. And I had some friends throughout the process that were really valuable resources, both socially and scholarly, who know a lot more than I do and were able to direct me and help me. And one of them was very, very encouraging that I begin to teach again. Like, Zevi, you must teach, you must share, you must go out there. And I was terrified to. I was really scared to teach because I was no longer just teaching what was the received wisdom for 3,000 years. It was new ideas, it was new thoughts, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm misleading people, and maybe what I'm doing is, and so that was very terrifying. And he's like, no, Zevi, do it on the internet. Just start sharing. You don't need an organization, you don't need an institution, you don't need a paycheck. Just start putting out your ideas and be honest about it, and share where you are and share your doubts, share that. And I started in the most unassuming way possible. I sat down, it was 2 a.m. The video is still down on the channel. It's the first video. I was wearing a pink hoodie, and I just did a book review. William Stace, Philosophy and Mysticism. I did that only because it was one of the only books that I actually had the cover on the book around so I could show it to the camera. It happened to be that it was a good title that worked well, that framed the project, Philosophy and Mysticism. And I just spoke like unedited, unscripted to the camera for half an hour about this book. And as soon as I released it, shared it with some friends and family. And the very first request was, Zevi, no more book reviews. We want to hear your own thoughts. We want to hear your own teachings. We want to hear your own overviews. The second video was my attempt to do a 10-minute history of mysticism, which at this point I would never have been as audacious to do, but I did it, and it's there, and it was a lot of fun to make. And then as I began releasing material, people began coming out of the woodworks saying, like, this is what we've been thinking about. This is the way we've been thinking about. This is what we're interested in. Like, and really very quickly beginning to develop not an audience, but a community and a family of people who are interested and corresponding with people who are interested. And I think simply the reason is because there's so much talk, there's so much available online about spirituality, new age stuff, and there's a lot of mysticism and astrology and all this. but there's very few places that are sitting down saying, let us think about these things really, really in a really radically critical, philosophical, historical, scholarly way, but in ways that aren't just, scholarly intellectual masturbations for the sake of that, but actually really embodied and lived and asking questions of society, questions of ourselves in ways that are really true to the real literature of mysticism. The sweet spot between doing it really rigorously and really, intellectually, but also really caring about practice and outcome and embodiment and enlivenment and community is a spot which I'm finding a lot of people are really resonating with. And I understand why that's resonating with people. And the amount of appreciation and camaraderie and sharing and opening up from people all over the world, from Muslims from Pakistan and Jews from all over the world, and Christians from Australia and who knows where, and people from India, literally, the internet is everyone and anyone. There was one day where on the same day I received almost identical emails from two women. One of them was a 60-year-old Episcopalian priest who had been studying and had become more ecumenical, and she really loved the work that I was doing, looking at Eastern thought in relation to Christian theology and Jewish theology. And then the same day, a few minutes later, an email from another woman, a porn star who was on her own spiritual journey and had her own questions and her own experiences, and also leaving, her childhood faith and coming to more universal. So on the facade, I think if you took all of the people that have come to the channel, we're about to hit 10,000 people as part of the community, which is really exciting. If you took them all and put them in a room, you would probably see no commonalities. There'd be people of all colors, of all races, of all genders, of all languages, but that shared quest for a real relationship with reality as we conceive it and as we experience it in a way that's done really thoughtfully and carefully and critically. I think that really unites them all. And a lot of the trajectory of leaving naive or unhelpful ways of thinking about the world, whether they be scientific or religious, towards a unified space. And it's a really, I'm really like ever so grateful to the community and to the questions and to the thinking that I could have possibly done on my own would have been so poor in comparison to my own journey now with all these people that are coming along for the ride. And where it goes, I have no idea. My intuition is that it won't stay on the internet forever. That it'll be downloaded into some sort of physical place. That's because I think that's really important. I'm thinking now in terms of creating a space, a studio for other people who are doing research and creative works to come collaboratively to create together under some sort of seek a studio. That's an idea. We're moving a bit more now into film, of going to meet people and interview people, particularly religious minorities, beginning with people here in Israel, a country which needs a lot of healing and a lot of unity. So there's a couple cool, there's a lot of cool projects in cool directions, and where it goes, only God knows.
That's so beautiful, man. And so, I remember as soon as I heard John Vervaeke describe you, and John's got I've come to trust John's antenna. I was like, oh my gosh, that guy's tracking somebody who almost certainly is a beautiful person. And I think you just articulated that John's got a very good sense of people in the world. And so I think that what you have done, the richness with what you've done it, the humility with which you've undertaken it, at the same time, the breadth and the seriousness with which you've done it, and the playfulness, at the same time embodying the goodness of being in the world. I mean, those are, what else can we ask for a sage? So
I really appreciate that. And seeing those characteristics are all things that I really try to embody: the seriousness and the playfulness and the expansiveness and the openness. These are all things which people may think are in contradiction, but they're not. They really all come together very, very beautifully. And I really can't take any credit for any of that. I think that it's all thanks to my mom primarily and my dad. They raised me and my siblings in a place that was full of love and acceptance and embrace, and gave us the permission to explore and gave us the permission to. And I think when someone is so fully grounded and comfortable in their own home, in their own space, in their own tradition, they feel the permission to go and explore and open up. I really do see my parents as my idols, and they led a lot of my work in terms of their own, less religious and philosophical, but their own humanitarian work,
their own educational work. So I take no credit. It's all my mom. You can.
Well, I
you can send
appreciate
her-
that heritage. I don't remember if I mentioned last time. My own heritage does go back. The name Henricus goes back to Sephardic Jews in Portugal. So I appreciate the heritage line very much, and I appreciate you honoring thy mother and father and all of that. So it's just been a really beautiful kind of articulation of where you're coming from. The resonance that I continue to feel is just really striking. The idea that there's this much resonance between the science of psychology and its practice in mysticism, all I would just say is wake up, people. The possibilities for an integrated pluralism in the back half of the 21st century are very real, very deep, very broad, and very, very hopeful. So that's super exciting. So I really appreciate you coming and sharing your wisdom with us today. It's been really delightful.
Thank you, Gregg. When things like this happen, I share your hope. So thank you.
Right. This moves the needle a little bit.
Yes.
And that's
yes.
all righty. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.